The night Lady Vivienne Sefton lost everything. The chandeliers above Ashford House held 300 candles, and every one of them was burning. She stood beside Lord Hartwell in pale gold silk, her gloved hand resting in his. 8 months of an engagement settled into the easy weight of expectation. The room arranged before them like a stage, the musicians poised, the guests assembled in their finest. She had dressed with particular care that evening, because she had wanted him to be proud of her, and that fact would stay with her for a long time afterward. Lord Hartwell turned to look at her, and for a moment she thought he was simply going to ask whether she was ready to open the dancing. Then he said, in a voice entirely audible to the nearest 24 guests, that he was sorry to cause her distress, but that it was her cousin he loved, Miss Philippa Sefton, standing 10 feet away at the edge of the floor. The room did not gasp. It held its breath. Vivienne felt the words land in her chest like a door closing in an empty house, and she stood there for 1 full second with the chandeliers burning above her and 300 people watching to see what she would do. She released his hand. She executed a curtsy, the precise, measured curtsy her mother had drilled into her at 14 years old, the one designed to communicate that nothing, under any circumstances, could disturb a Sefton's composure. Then she straightened, looked directly at Lord Hartwell, and said, in a voice of perfect calm, "Then go." She turned away from him without waiting for a response. Lord Dominic Ashmore stood at the edge of the dance floor, slightly apart from the nearest group of guests, his expression carrying the specific quality of a man watching something that requires his full attention. He was 34 years old, a second son of a duke, trained at the bar, and known throughout society as difficult to impress. He had been present at the Ashford ball because he was always present at such events. Not because they interested him, but because they were the territory through which he was required to move. He had watched the entire sequence from the moment Hartwell turned to speak, and he had not looked away once. Vivienne walked toward him. She was aware that every eye in the room had followed her, and she was also aware, with the particular clarity that comes from shock, that the next 30 seconds would define how this evening was remembered. "Lord Ashmore," she said, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" He said, "With great pleasure, Lady Vivienne," and offered his hand. She took it, and they walked onto the floor, and the musicians, after a brief hesitation that Vivienne would always be grateful for, began to play. For the next 30 minutes, Vivienne Sefton danced. She danced with the precision of a woman who has spent years understanding that the body can carry what the mind cannot yet hold. Ashmore's hand rested against her back with appropriate distance, proper in every respect, and she felt every inch of the contact with a sharpness that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the fact that the rest of her senses had gone very quiet. He did not offer sympathy. He did not lower his voice to say something kind and useless. He danced with her as though the dance were the only thing happening in the room, and she was grateful for that too. 10 feet away, at the edge of the floor, Philippa Sefton stood with her face drained of color. The expression she wore was not the expression of a woman caught in a secret. It was the expression of someone who has just understood, in a single instant, how they are being used. Nobody in the room noticed Philippa. Everyone was watching Vivienne, and Vivienne was giving them something worth watching. The third dance, the fourth. Her posture did not alter by a degree. When the music paused between sets, she accepted a glass of water from a footman, took 2 measured sips, and set it down. A woman across the room, Lady Cheswick, who had been at the Ashford ball every year for 20 years, turned to her companion and said something Vivienne could not hear. The companion looked at Vivienne and nodded slowly. Vivienne lifted her chin by a fraction and held it there. By the time the sixth dance ended, she had become the finest dancer in the room, and she had made absolutely certain that everyone present would remember it. Ashmore escorted her from the floor when the last note resolved. He walked with her through the assembled guests to the entrance hall, accepted her wrap from the footman, and handed it to her without comment. The carriage was brought around. He offered his hand to assist her in, and she took it. And she stepped up into the dark interior, and the door closed behind her. She did not cry until the carriage had turned the corner and the lights of Ashford House had disappeared behind her. And then she allowed herself 4 minutes, which was all she had decided to take. Then she sat straight again and looked at the dark window and began to think about what came next. 8 days passed. The condolence calls began the morning after the ball and continued in a steady, well-dressed procession that Vivienne received with perfect courtesy and absolutely no intention of confiding in any of them. She sat in the morning room at Sefton House, poured tea with a steady hand, accepted the careful expressions of sympathy, and said the same 6 sentences in slightly different arrangements until the last caller had taken her leave. Then she went to her desk and read the morning papers. The first account described the evening as an unfortunate scene, and noted that Lady Vivienne Sefton had conducted herself with admirable composure given the circumstances. The second account, in a different paper, referred to the abrupt termination of the Sefton-Hartwell engagement, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that Lord Hartwell had been seen leaving the ball in the company of Miss Philippa Sefton and her mother. The third account was the most damaging. It did not name anyone by name, but its description of a young woman of perhaps excessive confidence in her own attractions, who had misread the intentions of a gentleman of considerable standing, was clear enough to anyone who had been in the room. Vivienne read all 3 accounts twice, set the papers in a stack on the corner of her desk, and placed a paperweight on top of them. She did not write to Philippa. She did not write to Hartwell. She went to the music room on the 4th day and sat at the piano for an hour without playing a single note. And then she opened the manuscript she had been composing for 3 months and added 4 bars that surprised her with their sharpness. On the 9th day, Lord Dominic Ashmore arrived at Sefton House. Her father's butler announced him with a slight elevation of eyebrow that indicated an unexpected caller of some standing. Vivienne received him in the study, because the morning room felt too domestic for whatever this was going to be. Ashmore entered carrying a leather document folder, which he placed on the desk without preamble. He did not ask how she was. She appreciated that. "I have something to show you," he said. He opened the folder and arranged 3 documents on the desk in a deliberate sequence. The first was a letter. The second was a copy of a financial record. The third was a witness statement, signed and dated. "Lord Hartwell's affairs," Ashmore said, "have not been conducted with the consistency one might expect from a man of his position. Over the past several weeks, I have gathered evidence of a pattern of social and financial irregularities, some of them minor, some of them considerably less so, that suggests the termination of your engagement was not the simple matter of the heart it was presented as in the society pages." He paused. "There is also evidence that the subsequent narrative, the one suggesting you had misread the situation, or that some deficiency on your part contributed to the outcome, was not accidental." Vivienne looked at the documents. "You are proposing something," she said. "An alliance," Ashmore said. "Formal, defined, and practical. You have access to the social circles I cannot reach efficiently on my own, the drawing rooms, the salons, the networks through which this kind of damage is done and undone. I have legal expertise and investigative reach. You cannot exercise yourself without considerable disadvantage. He met her eyes. Together, I believe we can establish the truth of what happened, publicly and permanently. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. She looked at the documents again, the letter, the financial record, the signed statement. And she thought about the third newspaper account and the paperweight sitting on top of it. I will consider it, she said. She had already decided. She told him her terms the following afternoon, in the same study, with her father seated in the chair beside the window. If we are seen together in public, Vivienne said, we will appear entirely respectable, or we will not appear together at all. I will not give Lady Hartwell a second story to tell. Agreed, Ashmore said, without hesitation and without qualification. I will manage the drawing room contacts myself, she continued. I will not have anyone approach those circles on my behalf who does not understand them. That means I lead in that territory, and you follow my direction there. Also agreed. And I want to see everything you gather before it is used. I will not be a passive recipient of your conclusions. I want to understand the full picture. Ashmore looked at her for a moment. That is not how I typically work, he said. I am aware of that, Vivienne said. Those are my terms. A brief silence. Then Ashmore said, Very well. Her father, who had not spoken during the entire exchange, extended his hand across the desk. Vivienne and Ashmore both looked at him. He nodded once, indicating the desk surface between them. Vivienne placed her hand on the desk, palm up. Ashmore laid his hand over it. They shook, a formal agreement, witnessed, recorded in the posture of two people conducting serious business. Neither of them released the grip immediately. The handshake lasted 3 seconds longer than it needed to. Her father watched Ashmore with the careful attention of a man cataloging something for future reference. And Vivienne did not notice, because she was looking at the documents on the desk and thinking about where to begin. The investigation started that afternoon. 3 weeks followed in which Vivienne discovered what it was to work alongside someone who did not manage her. Ashmore brought the legal and documentary channels, correspondence traced through intermediaries, financial records obtained through connections Vivienne could not have accessed without his standing, witness statements gathered from individuals who would not have opened their doors to a woman arriving alone. Vivienne brought the drawing rooms. She called on 4 women who had been present at the Ashford ball and conducted conversations of exquisite indirection that yielded, in each case, a piece of information Ashmore had not been able to reach through his own methods. She mapped the scope of Lady Hartwell's social campaign with the precision of someone who had grown up inside the same machinery and understood exactly how it operated. They met every second afternoon at Sefton House to compare findings. Ashmore would arrive with papers. Vivienne would have notes written in a hand, so precise it might have been typeset. They worked across her father's desk, and the pile of evidence grew, and neither of them commented on the fact that the meetings had begun to run an hour longer than necessary. The hostile dinner came in the 3rd week. It was a gathering at the home of Sir Edmund Waverley, a mutual acquaintance whose wife had made the tactical error of inviting both Vivienne and a close friend of Lady Hartwell's to the same table. The friend, a Mrs. Caldwell, thin-faced and deliberate, spent the first course directing her conversation pointedly away from Vivienne's end of the table, and spent the second course making a remark about the difficulty of maintaining one's dignity when one has been so publicly mistaken in one's expectations, that was addressed to no one in particular and intended for everyone present. Vivienne set down her fork, looked at Mrs. Caldwell with an expression of mild interest, and said, I find dignity rather easier to maintain when one has not confused it with silence. Will you have more of the pheasant? The table went quiet. Then Sir Edmund laughed, and the moment passed, and Mrs. Caldwell did not speak in Vivienne's direction again for the remainder of the evening. Ashmore, seated 4 places away, had watched the entire exchange. He said nothing about it until they were outside, when he offered his hand to help her descend from the carriage step at Sefton House. She took it. At the bottom of the step, she was standing on level ground, and neither of them moved for 3 full seconds. His hand holding hers, the cold night air around them, the lamplight falling at a low angle across the stone. Then she withdrew her hand, and he released it, and she said good night and went inside. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment after the door closed. Then she went upstairs. It was 4 days later that she found the letter. She was reviewing the correspondence file, a collection of dated documents Ashmore had assembled and delivered to her for her own analysis, when she came to a letter that stopped her. It was addressed to a legal contact of Ashmore's, dated 3 weeks before she had ever accepted his proposal of alliance. The subject was the management of damage to the reputation of Lady Vivienne Sefton. The instructions were detailed, specific, and entirely protective. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk, placed her hands flat on either side of it, and looked at it for a long moment. The following afternoon, when Ashmore arrived, she was already standing at the desk. She waited until he had sat down. Then she placed the letter in front of him, held it flat with 2 fingers, and said, "Explain this." He looked at the letter. He did not look surprised. "The dates," she said. "This is 3 weeks before I agreed to anything. 3 weeks before you came to this house with that folder." She kept her voice even. "You were already working?" "Yes," he said. "Why?" Ashmore was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had the quality of a man choosing precision over ease. "I was at the Ashford ball," he said. "I watched what happened. I watched what Hartwell did, and I watched how it was being shaped afterward. In the papers, in the conversations the following morning, in the way certain people were already beginning to tell the story." He paused. "What was being done to you was deliberate, and it was being done by people with considerably more institutional reach than you could counter alone. I did not think it was acceptable to wait and see whether you would ask for help." "You did not tell me," Vivienne said. "No," he said quietly. "Why not?" He met her eyes. "Because you would have found it difficult to accept help you did not ask for, and because I was not certain you should ever need to know what it cost." Vivienne stood very still. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the letter, replaced it carefully in the folder, and sat down. "We have 3 more witness statements to review," she said. She did not look at him again immediately. But over the next hour, as they worked through the documents, she was aware, with a precision she could not have named, that she was watching him differently. The way he handled the papers, the way he listened when she spoke, not with the half-attention of a man waiting for his turn to contribute, but with the specific focus of someone for whom what she was saying was the only thing in the room that mattered. He noticed that she was watching. He did not say so. The music room was on the 2nd floor of Sefton House, east-facing, and in the late afternoon it held a particular quality of light that Vivienne had loved since childhood. The manuscript she had been working on for 3 months was spread across the piano stand and the small table beside it, 20 pages of notation in her own hand, a composition for piano that she had never shown to anyone outside the household. She showed it to Ashmore on a Thursday afternoon, when the investigation had reached a pause point, and there was an hour before he needed to leave. She was not entirely certain why she showed him. She told herself it was because she had mentioned it in passing. and he had asked a direct question about it. And she had found herself unable to deflect it with the standard answer she gave everyone else. He stood beside the piano and read the first page of the manuscript with the attention he brought to everything. Careful, unhurried, genuinely engaged. "This is not decorative," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not." He reached across to look at the second page, and as he did, the first page slid from the stand. They both reached to catch it at the same moment, and their hands met above the falling sheet, his fingers over hers, both of them holding the page steady. Neither withdrew. What followed was not the silence of awkwardness. It was the stillness of two people who are standing at the edge of something and have not yet decided whether to step forward. Ashmore was the one who finally set the page back on the stand. He straightened. He said, "When were you planning to perform it?" "I had 3 venues scheduled," Vivienne said. "Grantham Hall among them." "Then we need to make certain those dates hold," he said. And they returned to the desk, and the moment was not named. 2 days later, a note arrived for Ashmore from a mutual acquaintance named Mr. Forsyth, who had social connections running in several directions simultaneously and had always been cautious about which way he faced on any given day. The note declined a forthcoming invitation that included Vivienne's name and contained, in its final paragraph, a pointed observation that Ashmore's continued involvement in the Sefton matter was attracting notice in quarters that could prove inconvenient to him professionally and socially. Ashmore read the note at his desk. He set it aside. He wrote his reply the same evening, a brief, courteous, entirely unmoved acknowledgement that noted he would continue to make his own decisions regarding his associations. He sealed it, handed it to his man, and returned to the document he had been reviewing before the interruption. The alliance continued without alteration. Philippa Sefton arrived at the front door of Sefton House on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, having come up from Kent on the early coach. She was 24 years old, and she looked as though she had not slept well in several weeks. She asked the butler whether Lady Vivienne was at home and whether she might speak with her privately. Vivienne received her in the morning room. Philippa sat across from her with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, and she said, "I need to tell you what happened. All of it. Because what you believe happened is not what happened, and I cannot continue to allow you to carry that version." Vivienne said nothing. She waited. "I never loved Lord Hartwell," Philippa said. "Not once. Not for a single day. I have been in love with Mr. Daniel Ford for 2 years. He is a clergyman in my own county, and he has very little money, and my mother does not know. And I have been trying to find a way to tell her." She paused. "I did not know I was being used as a reason. I did not know that Lady Hartwell had decided to end the engagement. I did not know the engagement was being ended at all. Until Lord Hartwell spoke in the ballroom. The expression on my face that night was not guilt. I was not triumphant. I was not in love with him and waiting for my moment." She stopped. I was horrified, because I had just understood, in the space of those few seconds, what was happening to you and what my name was being used to accomplish. Vivienne sat with this for a long moment. "Lady Hartwell chose my name," Philippa continued, "because I was available and young and present, and because using a family member made the story cleaner. The engagement had already been scheduled for termination. I was simply the reason that was selected because it was the most convenient one. She identified you as too independent to manage and decided that clarity was inconvenient for her son's future." Philippa's voice was steady, but only just. "I am so sorry. I should have come sooner. I was frightened, and I told myself you would not want to hear from me. and I was wrong to let that stop me." Vivienne stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden for a moment, the frost on the stone path, the bare branches of the elm at the far end. Then she turned around. "Thank you," she said. "For coming, for telling me." She paused. "Will you stay for dinner?" she asked. Philippa looked at her with something very close to relief. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." That evening, after Philippa had retired to the guest room, Vivienne sat at her desk for a long time. The grief she'd been carrying had a different shape now. Less the jagged weight of abandonment, more the clean, cold clarity of someone who has finally seen the full picture and knows exactly what she is looking at. Lady Hartwell had looked at her and found her threatening. That was the truth underneath everything. Lady Hartwell had seen a woman of genuine independence and genuine talent, and had decided, with the dispassionate efficiency of someone accustomed to arranging outcomes, that such a woman should be removed. The anger that replaced the grief was considerably more useful. The witness came undone on a Wednesday. Her name was Mrs. Alston, and she had been present at 2 of the drawing-room conversations in which Lady Hartwell's campaign had been most explicitly conducted. She had agreed, tentatively, to provide a statement. On Wednesday morning, a note arrived at Sefton House informing Vivienne that Mrs. Alston would not, after all, be in a position to speak to the matter. The note was brief, apologetic, and offered no explanation, because none was needed. Lady Hartwell had reached her first. The plan, as it had been constructed, partially failed. That night, Vivienne went to the music room at 2 a.m. and sat at the piano. She had not been able to sleep, and she had told herself she would work on the composition. But when she sat down and placed her hands above the keys, she found she could not begin. The notes were there. She knew exactly what came next. But her hands would not move. And she sat there in the lamplight, with the manuscript open in front of her, and the silence of the house around her, and the knowledge that Mrs. Alston's withdrawal had cost them something they could not easily replace. She was not certain how long she had been sitting there when she heard the door. Ashmore came into the room without knocking. He was still in his coat, which meant he had not yet gone home, and she did not ask why he was still in the house at that hour, because she already understood the answer, and it was not something either of them was ready to name. He looked at her at the piano, and at the manuscript open in front of her, and at her hands above the keys. He did not say anything. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside the window. The room held its quiet around them. Then Vivienne placed her hands on the keys and played a single line, the opening phrase of the composition, 8 bars, spare and direct, and carrying in it everything the last 6 weeks had required her to hold. The notes fell into the quiet room and settled there. Ashmore remained in the chair by the window. She did not play the second phrase. She sat with her hands resting on the keys and the echo of the music in the air, and outside the window, the frost was beginning to form on the glass in the particular way it did, just before dawn. He stayed until the sky began to lighten. When Vivienne finally rose from the piano, she went directly to her desk and began writing the letter she would carry to Lady Hartwell's drawing room the following morning. She arrived at Lady Hartwell's house at 11 o'clock with 5 witnesses. 2 of them solicitors, 2 of them women of sufficient standing, that their presence alone constituted a statement, and one of them her father, who had asked to come and whom she had not refused. The butler admitted them after a brief pause that communicated considerable alarm. Lady Hartwell received them in the drawing room with the expression of a woman who had been expecting something and had not expected it to be this. Vivienne set a letter on the card table. "This is correspondence written by Lord Hartwell 6 months ago," she said. "In his own hand. It describes the engagement as entirely your arrangement, Lady Hartwell. not a matter of his affection or his choice. An arrangement created and discarded at your instruction for reasons of social convenience. She stood without moving. I am not here to request an apology. I am here to ask one thing, that in future, when you speak of me, you speak accurately. She looked at Lady Hartwell steadily. That is all. She left without waiting for a response, and her 5 witnesses filed out behind her. Before sunset that day, the letter had been described in drawing rooms across half of London. The social narrative, which had held its shape for 9 days, began to crack along its edges. Lady Hartwell moved within 4 days. 3 concert venues where Vivienne's composition had been scheduled for its first public performance received communications, politely worded, entirely untraceable to their source, and declined the bookings without explanation. The Grantham Hall date, the most significant of the 3, was refused on a Tuesday afternoon by a letter that arrived at Sefton House with the impersonal courtesy of a decision already made. Vivienne read the letter at her desk. Then she set it down and went to find Ashmore. He was in the study, reviewing the remaining documents. She placed the letter from Grantham Hall on the desk in front of him without comment. He read it, set it down, and was quiet for a moment. "There is a way," he said. "The Hall's principal patron, a Lord Cavendish Marsh, owes me a significant favor. It has been owed for 4 years. I have not called it in because I was reserving it for something that warranted it." He paused. "I will call it in for this." Vivienne looked at him. "What will that cost you?" He considered the question. A debt of that standing, once called in, is gone. He will not owe me anything afterward, and he will not forget that I used it for this purpose. He met her eyes. "Those are the costs." "And do you regret it?" she asked. He did not answer that question. Instead, he said, "Are you ready? For Grantham Hall, for all of it? Are you ready to do this publicly, under your name, with everything that follows?" She thought about the music room at 2 a.m. She thought about 8 bars of a composition she had been writing for 3 months, and about what it had taken to write them, and about what it would mean to play them in a full hall before an audience that included the people who had watched her humiliation at the Ashford ball. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." Ashmore secured the Grantham Hall date that afternoon. 3 days before the concert, a private note arrived from Lord Hartwell, delivered through an intermediary, addressed to Ashmore, brief and carefully worded. It stated that if he were asked, in the right room, on the right night, he would confirm the truth of what had happened. He would not volunteer it, but he would not deny it if directly asked. Everything now depended on one night. Grantham Hall held 400 people when it was full, and on the night of Vivienne's performance, it was full. She stood in the wings before the concert began and looked out at the assembled audience, the candlelight, the tiers of seating, the faces she recognized and the faces she did not. The particular quality of expectation that gathered in a concert hall just before the music started. Somewhere in that audience sat Lady Hartwell in the 4th row, with the composed expression of a woman who had arranged her position carefully and intended to use it. Somewhere in the center of the hall sat Ashmore, in a seat he had chosen for its sightlines to the stage and to the 4th row simultaneously. Vivienne walked out onto the stage. She sat at the piano, arranged the score, and placed her hands above the keys. The hall went quiet. She looked at the first bar of the manuscript, her handwriting, her notation, her name on the title page in her own hand, written there for the first time 3 days ago when Ashmore had asked her whether it was signed. She began to play. The The composition was not decorative. It was not the kind of music that served as pleasant accompaniment to a social evening. It was precise and demanding, and carried in it the specific emotional weight of everything the last 6 weeks had required her to become. The stillness of the music room at 2 in the morning, the cold clarity of the anger she had found after Philippa's visit, the 8 months of an engagement that had not been what she believed it was, and the discovery, in the middle of all of it, that she was more capable of fighting than she had known. The hall was very quiet. She played through to the final page without stopping, and when the last note resolved and she lifted her hands from the keys, there was a moment of silence before the applause began. It was the kind of silence that means the audience has not yet returned to themselves. Then the applause came, and it was sustained and genuine. And Vivienne sat at the piano for one moment before she rose and turned to face the room. Lady Hartwell rose from the 4th row. She rose with the deliberate authority of a woman who has selected her moment, and she began to speak, addressing the room rather than the stage, her voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who has controlled the narrative for long enough that she no longer expects to be interrupted. She spoke of the evening as a remarkable display of personal resilience, and she spoke of the composition as a touching expression of a difficult period. And she began to construct, in the space of 4 sentences, a version of events in which Vivienne's performance was a response to private grief rather than an act of public declaration, and in which Lady Hartwell herself occupied the position of a woman who had always wished the best for all parties involved. Ashmore rose from the center of the hall. He rose without haste and without theatricality, and when he spoke, his voice carried the specific quality of a barrister who has spent 15 years understanding exactly how much weight a sentence can bear. "I must correct the record," he said, "while we are all assembled and while the record is being discussed." The room turned toward him. He named the letter Lord Hartwell's own correspondence, 6 months old, describing the engagement as Lady Hartwell's arrangement from its inception. He identified the witness statements by source and by date. 4 individuals whose accounts he summarized in precise, unembroidered language that left no room for reinterpretation. He described the social campaign that had followed the Ashford ball, the 3 newspaper accounts, the pressure applied to Mrs. Alston, the blocked concert venues, the letter declining the Grantham Hall booking that had arrived without explanation or signature. He laid out the sequence with the calm specificity of a man presenting evidence in a proceeding where the facts are the only thing that matters. Lady Vivienne Sefton was publicly humiliated, Ashmore said, on the basis of a pretext. The pretext was constructed to conceal the actual reason for the termination of the engagement, which was that Lady Hartwell found her prospective daughter-in-law too independent to accommodate. The subsequent campaign was designed to ensure that Lady Vivienne could not recover her standing publicly. What you have heard this evening is the composition of a serious artist performing under her own name before this audience. That is the accurate account of what is happening in this room. Lady Hartwell said, "Lord Ashmore, you overstep. My mother acted alone." The voice came from 3 rows behind Lady Hartwell. Lord Hartwell was on his feet, his face carrying the expression of a man who has been waiting for the specific moment when the cost of silence exceeded the cost of speaking. He said it again, clearly, to the full room. "My mother acted alone. The engagement was her arrangement. The termination was her decision. Lady Vivienne Sefton had no part in any of it." The room was very still. Lady Hartwell sat down. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more definitive. She sat down because the room had shifted around her in the space of those 2 sentences, and she understood with the precision of a woman who had spent 40 years managing social environments that the shift was permanent. Vivienne stood at the edge of the stage and looked out at the assembled room, at the faces turning toward one another, at the particular quality of a crowd that has just revised its understanding of an event it believed it already knew. She stood there for a moment, and then she walked down the steps from the stage into the body of the hall, and the room parted around her as she moved. The garden behind Grantham Hall was frost-covered and empty, and the light through the tall windows of the hall fell across the stone path in long yellow rectangles. Vivienne had been standing there for perhaps 5 minutes when she heard the door behind her. Ashmore came to stand beside her. They were both quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden and at the frost on the low stone wall at its boundary. "The composition," he said. "What you played tonight." He paused. "It is the most extraordinary thing I have heard in London." Vivienne turned to look at him. "It is finished," she said. "I could not finish it before. I kept arriving at the final movement and finding it incomplete. I knew the shape of it, but I could not locate what it needed." She looked at him steadily. "6 weeks ago, I could not have written what I played tonight. What the last 6 weeks required me to become. That is what was missing." He was looking at her with the expression she had begun to recognize as the one he wore when he was feeling something he had not yet found language for. She stepped forward and kissed him. It was not impulsive. It was a decision made with the same deliberateness she brought to every decision she considered important. And it was made with full awareness of where they were and what it meant. His hand came up to her face, and he kissed her back with the specific care of a man who understands that this is not a moment to be careless with. When she stepped back, she looked at him and said, "Tell me why you started before I asked. The real answer." He was quiet for a moment. The frost was on the wall, and the light was in the windows, and the sound of the hall behind them was muffled and distant. "Because I watched you keep dancing," he said. "In the ballroom, after Hartwell spoke, you turned away from him and you asked me to dance. And you danced for 30 minutes with 300 people watching you. And you were magnificent. And I understood in those 30 minutes that what was being done to you was an injustice I was not willing to observe from a distance." He paused. "I could not leave. I have not been able to leave since." Vivienne held his gaze. "Then stay," she said. 6 weeks later, the Ashford Ball held its annual charity concert. The invitations had gone out with the usual names, and the usual guests had accepted, and the chandeliers above Ashford House were lit with 300 candles, as they were every year. The musicians were assembled. The room was full. Vivienne arrived on Ashmore's arm. She wore deep blue silk, and her hair was dressed simply, and she walked into the room with the posture her mother had given her and the expression of a woman who has chosen to be exactly where she is. The room noticed. Of course the room noticed. The room always noticed Vivienne Sefton. But what it noticed this time was different from what it had noticed 2 months ago. And everyone present understood the difference without needing to have it explained. The room adjusted itself around them, the way rooms do when the people entering them have become, in the interim, the people everyone wants to be near. Lady Cheswick, who had been at the Ashford Ball every year for 20 years, caught Vivienne's eye across the room and inclined her head, not the careful nod of someone managing a delicate social situation, but the direct acknowledgement of one woman recognizing another. Vivienne inclined her head in return. Later, in the music room at Sefton House, the lamp burned low on the table beside the piano. The composition rested on the stand, all 20 pages of it, in Vivienne's own hand, signed with her name on the title page in the ink she had used 3 days before the Grantham Hall concert. The signature was not tentative. It was the hand of a woman who has decided that her name belongs on what she has made. 2 cups of tea sat on one tray on the small table by the window. Frost had gathered on the glass in the particular pattern it made just before the temperature dropped further, and through it the garden was a gray and silver wash of shapes in the early dark. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was warm and quiet and entirely itself. The lamp went out.